G'day Groovers. Here's a limited list of the scientific publications showing the valuable health contributions of unprocessed red meat, and also the research indicating a lack of connection between red meat, saturated fat and disease. Firstly, a little bit of background. A lot of us have become confused about whether red meat is healthy or not, mostly because it still gets a heap of negative press, and it seems we're always told to eat less of it. And yet, red meat is an important healthy food. So I'm going to list some of the science showing why red meat is a very important healthy food that is not significantly associated with any disease condition like heart disease or cancer. Importantly, this list does not cover nor advocate chicken or any processed meats including ham, sausage, hot dogs, salami, bacon, beef jerky and deli meats. It is fair to say there exists some correlation between processed meats and some diseases, but it's outside the scope of this video, and I simply don't recommend them from a health perspective. I recommend only unprocessed red meat. I want to point out that this is far from a conclusive list, but in order to keep the video fairly short, I've left out a large number of papers also advocating unprocessed red meat as a valuable component of a healthy diet. And just for the record, I excluded all studies where I found a conflict of interest, such as any connection to meat industry organisations. All but one of the papers I'm listing were published since 2009. So this is up-to-date information. Okay, let's start with several studies variously indicating a lack of connection between saturated fat, animal protein and/or red meat and heart disease or cancer. This 1998 review covered dozens of studies of various types and found absent or negative associations in the more recent studies, and concluded there is a lack of evidence linking saturated fat and coronary disease in any of the study types analysed. This 2010 meta-analysis of 21 prospective cohort studies published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition found no credible evidence of a link between saturated fat and cardiovascular disease. The authors remarked, intake of saturated fat was not associated with an increased risk of coronary heart disease, stroke, or cardiovascular disease. Moving right along, this 2010 systematic review and meta-analysis published in the journal Circulation concluded that consumption of processed meats, but not red meats, is associated with higher incidence of coronary heart disease and diabetes mellitus. They also pointed out that even though dietary guidelines in many countries recommend that consumption of red and processed meat should be moderated, this assertion is derived in large part from expected negative effects of saturated fat, which are not well established, with considerably conflicting results in prior studies. This 2014 systematic review and meta-analysis published in the Annals of Internal Medicine concludes that, and I quote, current evidence does not clearly support cardiovascular guidelines that encourage high consumption of polyunsaturated fatty acids and low consumption of total saturated fats. And just for the record, this paper was funded by the British Heart Foundation and the Medical Research Council, among other fairly conservative British establishment organisations. And that's not all. This 2015 paper, co-authored by a number of researchers from the Harvard School of Public Health, including the very high-profile nutritionist Walter Willett, identified a very interesting result in regard to colon cancer. They found a statistically significant inverse association between unprocessed red meat intake and distal colon cancer, meaning unprocessed red meat appears to reduce risk of this type of colon cancer, while they also found a weak, statistically non-significant positive association between unprocessed red meat and the risk of proximal colon cancer. So stronger evidence that red meat protects from cancer at the tail end of the colon, and weaker evidence that red meat contributes to cancer at the near end of the colon. So hard to conclude anything solid from this other than leaning slightly in favour of the protective effect of red meat, but enough to suggest that more research would be a good idea. Right, so now we've looked at the absence of links to disease, let's look at several papers showing the undeniable health benefits of animal protein and red meat. This article, published in the Proceedings of the Nutrition Society in 2016, explains how the high-quality protein and other nutrients in red meat can provide a useful contribution to the intakes of key nutrients commonly found to be in short supply in the diets of young infants, adolescents, women of childbearing age, and older adults. They point out that the average UK consumption of red meat for women falls below the figure advised by the Department of Health. In this 2020 article published in the journal Critical Reviews in Food Science and Nutrition, the authors argue that reduction in meat consumption could produce serious physiological harm. They assert that diets high in meat have proved successful over the long history of our species, while the benefits of alternative protein sources are far from being established. Now, while we bicker over the relative superiority of animal versus plant proteins in the developed world, the capacity middle and lower income countries have to choose their nutrition sources depends on affordability and availability to populations often struggling to make ends meet. Pun not intended. This 2021 review article, published in the Maternal and Child Nutrition Journal, makes the case that essential amino acids obtained from animal-sourced foods are critical in ensuring optimal growth and development, and avoiding physical stunting that remains a serious problem globally in children aged under 5 years. They point also to micronutrients such as zinc, iron, iodine, magnesium, calcium, B vitamins, vitamin A and vitamin D that supply building blocks as well as regulate the processes involved in growth and development. The final papers in my list refer to older adults, and seeing as that is exactly what I am, it's a special interest of mine. So I'll cover 3 very interesting pieces of research. This paper, published in the Journal of the American Geriatric Society in 2014, looked at 2 time points 7 years apart and compared what level of animal protein the participants consumed and how their higher level functional capacity changed over that time span. Higher level function in this context means ability to carry out the practical activities of daily living, intellectual activity, and social roles. They found that higher consumption of protein, particularly animal protein, was associated with lower risk of decline in higher level functional capacity in older men. The Chianti study from 2021 included community-dwelling older adults in the Chianti region of Italy and was published in the journals of gerontology. Among the study population of 1,139 adults of a mean age 75 years, red meat made up on average 20% of the participants' animal protein source. The researchers observed that higher intakes of animal protein were associated with lower risk of all-cause and cardiovascular mortality after 20 years of follow-up. Finally, and also in regard to older adults, This study, published in the journal Clinical Nutrition in 2021, showed that only animal protein, not plant protein, was linked with lower risks of functional impairment, and higher animal protein intake led to 34% and 48% greater preservation of grip strength in men and women respectively. Grip strength has long been closely correlated with healthy aging and self-determination in advanced years. So there it is, just a small subset of the many studies indicating the health benefits of animal protein and the lack of association between red meat and any disease. I could have made a very long video listing the supportive scientific literature, but I won't because I want to go paddleboarding and that's more fun. So should we eat less red meat? I certainly don't think so. Even though I do agree with consuming less chicken, less pork and less processed meats, but that's a topic for another video. So I hope this was useful to you as a reference for some quality research literature. If you found this information interesting, then please consider subscribing to the channel and have a beaut day. I'll see you in the next video.